Hey, everybody. Jen Hatmaker here, your host of the For the Love podcast. Welcome to the show. So, man, I never want this series to end. We are continuing our series on matriarchy today, and we are getting into a concept that is profound, it is transformative. I'm excited to have this conversation in our community because we are going to talk about this idea of matrescence. Now, if you are wondering what the heck matrescence is, don't worry. You're in good company. I mean, even now, as I'm sort of reading my notes and prep for this interview, the word matrescence has a red squiggly line underneath it. And Google's like, we don't know what that is. We are heading into some interesting and powerful frontier today, folks. So let me start with that. And we will obviously unpack this in the interview. But matrescence is a concept that is relatively, although it was introduced in the 70s, it's newer to the cultural zeitgeist, but it has a lot of potential to transform how we think about the early season of pregnancy and motherhood. So the idea is to give it a name so we can begin to treat it as the profound medical and identity shifting experience that it is. Matrescence, and as Lucy, who I'm about to introduce you to, just explained, think of it like adolescence. So matrescence is this pregnancy, childbirth, early motherhood season of life. It's so funny because I became a mom 26 years ago, but I remember that season like it was yesterday. The ideas that people handed me, the narratives, like this is what motherhood is, this is what pregnancy is, this is what your role here is, this is how you should behave, this is what a good mother looks like, this is what she says and does, this is what she doesn't say and do. And it was so profoundly lonely and overwhelming. I was certainly not prepared for the body implications, the emotional implications, the way that literally my physiology was restructured, all of it. And so we are getting into this today with some pretty incredible myth busting as well. I'm so delighted to introduce you to today's guest. We have an author and a journalist here, Lucy Jones. She has done some pretty groundbreaking work here. Her latest book is called Matrescence on Pregnancy, Childbirth, and Motherhood. And it is a no holds barred investigation on what the reality is for caregivers and their infants, not just experientially, although that is in there, but also physiologically, biologically, socially. In fact, the Guardian's review of her book called it bloody and alive. So we're not messing around here. Like we're in brass tacks. So Lucy's fascinating and so wonderful. You're going to love her in this interview. She has a science journalism background. Which obviously she puts into play here as she writes fairly unflinchingly about how nature is not always kind in the way that it nurtures life during pregnancy and beyond. And the more that we talk about all the different experiences that women can have at this very intense season, the more we can both better understand and equip them with resources for motherhood, and pull this scenario out of the realm of overwhelm and loneliness and isolation and shame. Let me tell you a little bit about Lucy. She's a writer. She's a journalist based in Hampshire, England. Her writing on culture, science, and nature has been published everywhere, like GQ, BBC Wildlife, The Guardian, New Statesman. She's the author of Foxes Unearthed and Losing Eden, which was longlisted, by the way, for the Wainwright Prize and named a Times and Telegraph Book of the Year. And now Matrescence has been longlisted for the inaugural Women's Prize for Nonfiction. So this is a really profound piece of work that is garnering attention, and as it should. But mainly, I'm excited today for those of you who have ever or are currently feeling overwhelmed by early and young motherhood, by pregnancy, by the stories that you were or were not handed, by this template that doesn't actually dovetail at all into the real story. And so you're going to be encouraged. You're going to be hopeful today. This is going to be like a cold glass of water on a hot day. And also for any of us for whom that stage of motherhood and pregnancy is in our rearview mirror, that's me for sure. It still felt so warm to me to have this conversation with Lucy in which I just felt seen. And I remember some of the tears that I shed all by myself, sitting alone in a nursery with one of my babies who I treasured and adored. And at the same time, I was so freaked out and afraid and ashamed and worried. And this was retroactively comforting. And I hope it is for you too. And so, this is good, not just for anyone who's ever been a mother or is a mother or wants to be a mother, but for all the mothers in our lives that we love, for our communities. And as she put it, this is up to us to change. And so anyway, what an amazing conversation. So please enjoy this discussion with the wonderful Lucy Jones. Lucy, welcome to the show. I'm so very glad that you are here. I know my community well, and everyone's going to be on their edge of their seat for this conversation. So thanks for coming.
It's such a pleasure. I'm really hyped to be here and speak to you and meet you. Thank you.
I've told my community a little bit about you, but would you mind, before we sort of dive into your specific body of work, just a little bit about you? Like, this is who you are, and this is where you are, and these are your people, and this is kind of your deal.
Sure. So I'm speaking to you from England, where I live in a small town outside London, surrounded by beautiful woodlands. I am married to a man, and I have 3 children who are quite young still, 3, 4, and 7. And I am a writer. I've written 4 books, and I'm a journalist. And I am always trying to figure out life, I suppose.
Yeah.
In many different ways. So yeah, that's me.
Yep. And those of us who write figure it out by writing. One of my favorite writers who's passed on, but he said something like, I do not yet know what's in my heart, but I suspect I will find it as I write. And I'm like, yep, that's how it works. And so speaking of that, you have a really interesting bit of work out in the world right now. And it's a word, frankly, that I had to figure out how to pronounce. It's not in the zeitgeist yet. Matrescence, which is the name of your book. And so for people who are they just hit download and they're listening to this episode, let's just start at the highest entry point here. What is that? What does that mean? Did you make that word up, or is that a real word? And let's start there. But then the next thing I'd like to hear is, why does this matter to you? What was your funnel into this space as a journalist, as a writer, as someone who went, I want to spend a handful of years on this subject?
Thank you for giving the chance to talk like this. Okay, so a simple definition. It's a very simple concept, really. Matrescence simply means the process of becoming a mother. So the word is a little bit like adolescence. I did not make it up. It was coined by the late American anthropologist Dana Raphael in the 70s. So she coined the word matrescence. She also coined the word doula. And the first text and source which introduces this word to us is in a essay collection which was published in 1974, where Dana Raphael talks about how in most cultures and societies across the world, people have always had a sense that a mother is born when a baby is born, that a sense of the newborn mother, and that becoming a mother is recognized in most places as a kind of traumatic life crisis, a time where all of your I mean, obviously for a lot of people it's a wonderful joy, but it's also a time when everything changes physically, of course, but also she describes in your identity, in your social relationships, in your roles, in your everyday life, in your mind, your psychology, your emotions. And then this concept was developed in academic circles and has been written about by academics for the last kind of 10, 20 years. I wrote a book called Matrescence, which is about primarily my own matrescence. And I wanted to call it that. And I became so interested in the subject because discovering that word absolutely transformed my life. So I came to it through an article by the reproductive psychiatrist Alexandra Sachs in the New York Times. I had, my daughter was born in September 2016. I had little idea about anything really to do with motherhood. I was very happy to be pregnant. She was much longed for. But I found myself totally blindsided by becoming a mother. Birth was obviously incredibly intense. I found myself really mixed up in a lot of ideologies and myths and ideals around, wanting to be a kind of scare quote natural mother. And I found that it was the most kind of psychological, emotional, existential, spiritual experience of my life. And at the time, I thought I was going mad. Everything around me in my culture was like, it's all about the baby. You will go back to work quickly. You'll be the same. You'll bounce back, get your body back. I thought my body was like a box or a flower pot in pregnancy. And then when she was born, I would go back to myself. But that was absolutely not the case. So I spiraled a bit into a bad place, and I was diagnosed with postnatal depression, and just found that first year seismic and bewildering. But then I found this article and I read this word matrescence, and it said, this is the process of becoming a mother. Of course, joy is normal, but so is fear. So is bringing up your own childhood stuff. So is anger. So is resentment. And for the first time, my shoulders dropped and I felt like I could breathe. And I was like, okay, this is what it is. This is what my culture hasn't been able to prepare me for, but this is what it is. And it's normal and it's okay. Well, it's not okay in our society, which I'm sure we'll go on to, but it is part of it.
Yes. Wow. I was a young mom when I became one. I had my oldest son when I was 23. And so I didn't, my peers were obviously not mothers yet. And I was just early to the story. And there was just so very little about anything. Everything that you just said was not anything I ever heard. My culture, the breadth of the preparation was really more like, this is your highest calling and it will be magic, and this is what you're here for, and this is a miracle, and it will feel as such. And I had no idea, absolutely no idea. of the scope. Some of that was true, some in pieces and occasionally, and sometimes it wasn't. And so I'd like to hear, I love that you grabbed that word and article. This just on a side note, it just reminds me that words matter, and people who take the time to write an article or a book or a thought piece, it matters. These words travel to us and can really change our trajectory. So you grab a hold of this word, this concept, and then what? What did you do first? Because also you've got a baby. And as mentioned, your body is literally different. And in some ways will always be. And so I'd love to hear what the early process looked like for you of research, of discovery, of investigation. What did you start to find out?
Sure. And firstly, I so relate to what you said about your imaginings or the expectations that had been presented to you about motherhood. I grew up in a very conservative, patriarchal, cult-like Christian sect.
Oh, yeah.
So we have some
Now we're talking.
similarities. Yeah. Kind of conservative evangelical sect in England, which I've broken away from. But I was very much brought up in that. And it was, women weren't allowed to preach and all this stuff. So my image as well in my head was the very calm and chilled, Virgin Mary, like the pictures on my wall when I was growing up of, Jesus was never having a tantrum. It looked chilled. It looked natural. So I think that added to the shock. So what happened next? Well, discovering this word, well, I didn't discover it, but happening upon it in this article, gave me the confidence to start talking to other mothers. Even though I had my kids, I was about 31 when my first child was born, not many of my peers were having children. And I found that when I went to baby groups and mother and toddler groups, I don't know what you guys call them over there, but it was like I'd almost sometimes leave even more lonely because no one was talking about how they felt and how it feels to have your heart, walking around outside your body. And I was thinking about death all the time, and I was like having this existential crisis, and I was terrified, and I was angry that I was so vulnerable, having this thing that I love more than anything in the world. I was like, this is blowing my existential mind, and everyone's talking about nap schedules and feeding and stuff. So eventually finding this word matrescence gave me the confidence to talk to other mothers. And what I found was that so many of them, once they could open up, were really struggling. Of course, most of them were overjoyed to have their baby. Loving the babies was not difficult, but there was anger, there was stress, there was dangerously extreme sleep deprivation. I felt that there was like an epidemic of women oppressed and suppressed by really cruel maternal ideals, which kind of in matrescence seem to kind of trap people who previously would be even independent thinkers, and that it was like walking onto a stage in a new part, which meant the feeling rules, which is an Ali Hochschild term, were so strong, the psychological police state of motherhood. So that gave me kind of the confidence to interview people and to start writing. And also, of course, there's also a lot of taboo around maternal joy and maternal bliss. It's almost like everything about motherhood is a taboo. In the workplace, you have to pretend you don't have kids, and everyone gets embarrassed and bored if you start talking about how much you love your kids. It's, the whole thing is so diminished and disavowed. But what happened was I write science journalism as well. And I was so lucky that at the same time that I started to really try and record exactly what was happening to me, some of the earliest landmark, groundbreaking neuroscience was being published about the parental brain. And there's this kind of matriarchy of scientists now who many of whom are women, not all, but who are working in these areas to try and fill multitude, myriad gaps that we have around the maternal experience. And one of them, for example, was in 2016, the first study was published which showed that pregnancy renders pronounced and significant changes to the human brain. So it literally makes your brain change shape as powerfully as adolescence. Now, of course, not all mothers are pregnant. And we also know that, and this won't be news to anyone who is an adoptive mother or indeed a father or a non-birthing mother, but the brain also changes in non-birthing parents through hands-on care and affectionate touch. It's the baby which, after the birth, can change the brain of the caregiver. And I'll end on this point. I'm going on a bit, but
oh no, I want you to. You know? This is fascinating. The neuroscience behind it is absolutely fascinating. You could talk about this as long as you want. Okay. It does make sense.
Yeah, right. It does, because we evolved. You know, I didn't realize this before I became a mum. I thought the nuclear family is the tradition. And actually, you know, we evolved in collective caregiving networks. For 95% of our evolutionary history, there were many what's called allo parents and allo mothers. So lots of different people helping the mum, responding to the baby, fathers being involved too, you know, with the very clear knowledge that mothers can't do it all and that they need to rest. And it's actually probably better for the baby to have lots of people. So that it makes sense that, you know, we're all born with the neural circuitry to care for infants. And all this science is kind of upending a lot of our kind of oppressive patriarchal traditional ideas, which I think even in 2024 really come in with teeth in motherhood.
I think this all the time when I catch the tale of what the motherhood story looks like in other countries and other cultures. And it is so opposite what we experience here and you experience there. It is so communal. The mother's recovery and sleep schedule is prioritized. The community comes around the baby and the family. Like, it is, the men and the women all have time off work, extended time, paid. And it shocks me when I hear it. I just think that cannot be true. Is this true? And I realize other cultures have figured this out. And that feels so much more healthy and nurturing and making that phase possible. But I mean, it would not have occurred to me to solicit that level of help when I had the babies. I did almost everything with a smile, because it was, you know, my highest calling. And I remember sitting in my rocking chair with my firstborn, and he was maybe 4 days old, maybe 5, and just like unbidden tears, just like falling down my face. And I just remember sitting there going, I was 23, going, what is wrong with me? And do I not love my baby? I didn't know what to do with feelings, and nobody told me I'd have any. So, okay.
You just hear the baby blues. You
yes.
just have the baby blues on, like, you know, and that it's just like minimizing this kind of huge seismic dramatic experience. Yeah.
Yeah, just a kind of a cute little phraseology around it, and kind of like a chin up, little girl, little lady, like, you know, you'll just press on. And I wonder what it would have been like to have been surrounded with some of your scaffolding and your research and the language of it, the physiology of it. I'm hopeful for younger moms in the next generation. I love how you are saying that this body of neuroscience is not just new, but growing. And I wrote down what you said about the matriarchy of scientists, because that is a profound phrase. I want to ask you this specifically. Obviously, you just mentioned that your background is also science writing, so that you're no stranger to parsing out a lot of complicated scientific data and making it accessible to readers. And so in Matrescence, you write pretty critically, not just about what is the neuroscience teaching us, but to expose fallacies, myths, that are sold, have been sold for a long time to expecting mothers. I'd really like to hear you talk about some of those. What did you uncover? I think most of us are going to know these experientially when you say them. And maybe what the data, what the science suggests as an alternative to these narratives.
Sure. Well, how long have you got, Jen?
Yeah,
I mean,
totally. I know, right?
I mean, I think this, like the institution of motherhood today is just like laden still with myths and half truths and misinformation and deception. I mean, scientists only figured out, I think, last year why people get morning sickness. And what, I mean, I say morning sickness, I'm doing scare quotes here because, like, you know, as many of us know, that is a complete lie. It's all day sickness, but it's called morning sickness, which again minimizes and denies the actual experience. So scientists found out why there might be pregnancy, nausea, and sickness last year in 2024. I mean, how has it taken that long?
Right, because it's for women, not for men.
Exactly. And I mean,
Yes.
that's an example of where I think there's a pattern of this that we see, that things are falsely named, or they are there's not much known about them. And so then, you know, for me, for example, I was very sick, very extremely nauseous for about 5 or 6 months in my pregnancies. And because it was called morning sickness, I felt like a failure or ashamed that I didn't want to complain because I thought, oh, it's just morning sickness. You know, everyone just, you know, you eat ginger biscuits and so on. And I think we can see this in lots of different ways through the motherhood experience, like we were just talking about baby blues. And what I've seen in my conversations with women and in my reading is that this epidemic of disavowing the maternal experience leads to shame, and the stigma leads to a kind of abandoning of the self, almost a kind of closing down. I've been so overwhelmed. So Matrescence is out in the States, I don't know, around in May. I'm not sure when this goes out, but it's been out in the UK for almost a year. And the amount of messages I've had from women who have said things like, you know, you're writing things I've never been able to say out loud or articulate. I've felt angry for years. I've not been able to ever kind of speak these feelings or these experiences. But going back to kind of the myths and the narratives, well, one of the areas that I found quite challenging was I love nature and I love the natural world and I write about nature, and I was quite taken in by this idea of kind of natural motherhood, you know, natural birth and long-term breastfeeding and, you know, a natural maternal instinct, being able to, the whole deal, right? And that's very much here what is very much put on a pedestal. Yeah. And my experience was that, I mean, birth is, there's a brilliant novelist in the UK called Claire Kilroy, and she calls it, you know, you're split open from the inside. I mean, that's not going to be great. I mean, it wasn't for me. I know
It's
some people
not
have
going to be
fantastic
great.
births, like from a lot of people. It's
That's
just
hard.
traumatic.
Yeah.
That's,
Yes.
you know, and it, you know, I did all the things that I thought I should do, like all the hypnobirthing and all the breathing, and actually I found the pain to be, you know, almost indescribable. And then feeding, I had really big breastfeeding struggles, and I so desperately wanted to breastfeed my baby exclusively for the time we were meant to, and I felt like a complete failure because I couldn't produce milk, enough milk, and going onto formula, it was devastating for me. And now looking back, I can see that my children are fine. They were mixed fed. Formula is fine. But I was so taken in by this kind of breast is best idea that I couldn't even see straight. And I think for me, that really precipitated a real sinking, which a sense of like catastrophic failure, that I was failing my beautiful daughter, which actually precipitated postnatal depression for me. And then you've got this idea and this myth of, the natural maternal instinct, which I think that people, or I imagined, I would just know what to do. We know they say things like, books will say like the Spock book. It says like, you know best, and then there's 800 pages of instructions.
Right.
A bit disingenuous, right? But
right.
There's this idea that like, trust your instinct. And I had an instinct to protect and care for and love my baby, but she cried for hours every day and I couldn't soothe her. And there was nothing, I was just holding her and she was crying, and that went on for months. And, there's something quite difficult about being alone in the house and listening to, being with a crying baby. And there was a point where I thought, I can smell smoke. Like, my nervous system is not evolved for this, like this level of, and I did have probably a higher needs baby, but this kind of isolated, intensive caregiving when my husband was out at work. And to speak to your previous point about the cultures in the UK and the US and how we're probably the most individualistic nations, I suppose, I was trained to be self-reliant and self-sufficient, and that asking for help is so uncomfortable for me. So even though I have a very loving family, asking for help was, I'm still trying to learn that, like 8 years in. So, I think these myths go on and on, but and then we see, like, in more specific to science and medicine and health, there are so many research gaps and areas, like, for example, recovery after childbirth. Like, there can be lots of complications with childbirth and what it does to the maternal body and how that can affect you years afterwards. I think there's something that happens in matrescence where, like, it can affect your long-term, your hormones, your PMS. I know so many women, this is just anecdotal, who, me included, who their PMS, their moods and their, well-being before their periods, after giving birth, is just totally different and much harder. They call it PMDD. And I feel like there's just, which is just called hormones, all this stuff. We see it, like, people learning a bit more about menopause and stuff, but we desperately need nuance and an investment in women.
And don't you think, I'm wanting to lay the axe at the root of the tree and think systemically here, because I'm also, as you're speaking, I'm realizing how many instances that you just described, the chief offenders are women telling other women, this is what's best, this is what's right, this is how to do it. It's sometimes we're a part of the whole system. It's not truly not our fault. Like, we were handed a story and we believed it. It's just kind of that simple. And then we found our hooks into the system and we contribute to it. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on the systemic challenges here that make all of this hard. That, to your point, hell, we are discovering neuroscience around this year, in the year 2024, our Lord. What in the world? There's science delays. There's cultural misinformation. This comes down to an individual experience, but it is a really big system that a lot of us are experiencing. And so what are some of those systemic challenges that make truth harder to access here, good instruction, hope, a different storyline, and then ultimately the capacity to make different choices.
You put that so well, Jen. And, just thinking about the science when you were speaking, like, isn't it kind of interesting that in our cultures in the global north, we need science to tell us something which, most people know, which is that, of course, becoming a mother is a big deal. And we have, there are lots of cultures and societies which have these rites and these rituals and these ceremonies, which hold the newborn mother and which facilitate a way of looking after the mother while she heals, so she can look after the baby, and acknowledging, safe passage through childbirth, and like what a big thing that is. But you're right, it's incredibly systemic. And one of the most useful concepts that I found in my writing, in my research, was the poet Adrienne Rich, in her book of Woman Born, which was published 50 years ago in the 70s, and which I read it, I was like, okay, this is like my life now. How is that the case? Like, I thought me and my husband were equal in like social stature, and like, and then a baby is born and like the world sees you completely differently. So Adrienne Rich talked about the institution of motherhood and the experience of motherhood, and she distinguished between the two, which I think is really helpful and useful for us today, because it allows us to critique and think about the systems and structures of the institution, and then keep that separate from the experience of motherhood. Because my sense, and this is definitely how I have felt, is that people think that any complaint about motherhood is seen as a complaint about a child. And we all adore our children, so you don't want anyone to think that you don't love your kids. I think that is one of the things which means really difficult to talk about motherhood, because as a society, people are also on the alert for child stuff. And anyway, the point is, this concept about the institution of motherhood is really, really helpful. And if we go a bit deeper, I think there is so much layered on mothers and new mothers. So we have these like old guys from the past, going even back to like Aristotle and Aquinas, who basically said that you might think women are the ones who create people and have babies, but actually it's actually men. They made up these kind of crazy stories to try and kind of minimize women. And then you've got the Industrial Revolution, and you have decisions being made by, in the global north, these male thinkers, where they are creating this industrial institution of motherhood, whereas before it was much more collective, it was much more people were kind of living alongside each other. Then you've got the men going off to factories and so on, and the women at home, and then you see these maternal ideals developing, where motherhood is very sentimentalized. There's the angel in the house. There is the woman becomes this kind of symbol of the hearth and kind of a sanctuary. So what we're battling today is quite big, deep-seated cultural ideas. But what I found really useful, and what I tried to do with my book, is if we can see that and see how that was constructed and how it was invented, and that every society and culture invents its idea of motherhood, then we can become empowered to dismantle those ideas and create our own ways of being mothers, our own ways of caring. Andrea O'Reilly, who's an incredible writer, and I don't know if you know her, but she's so wonderful. She coined this. She's absolutely a matriarch as well. She coined this phrase, matricentric feminism, which is a feminism for mothers, which isn't to say, all feminism should be for mothers, but that there needs to be a feminism for mothers. And then you've got, there's a lot of kind of revolutionary, radical motherhood ideas. Adrienne Rich, I'll end on this, talked about being kind of an outlaw of the institution of motherhood. But I think that the factor that can help individuals and societies go from, this kind of trap, as it were, to empowered mothering, and a society which values care, which we clearly don't, is through, it's so obvious, but connection and talking and, words and sharing our vulnerability, and sharing our interdependence, which I will end on this, which our dominant cultures tells us is not true. We're told we're kind of these isolated individual machines. We've got to be self-reliant. We've got to be self-sufficient. You don't need anyone. That's a sign of weakness. But that doesn't work. Like, when you're bringing children into the world, it's a fallacy.
I have one more question for you, kind of a final word from you that I'd love to hear, because the data it's startling, it's alarming. Postnatal depression globally, 17%. That's high. That's a lot. In the UK, suicide's the leading cause of death for women during the period between 6 weeks and 1 year after giving birth. That's a big deal. There is a lot here. This isn't an alarmist conversation. Women are not hysterical. This is just real. And so you, having experienced all of this and then moved into the space of research, writing, discovery, investigation, examination, what have you learned? So I've got kind of two questions here. Based on everything you have now sort of assimilated, how is this affecting your motherhood? What have you done to go, okay, if I get to write and need to write my own story of motherhood, if that is upon us, it's our right and our duty to do so. What does that mean for you? Like, what looks different? What are some of the rhythms that you've challenged, or whatever it is? I don't know. I'd love to hear it. And then finally, I'm thinking about my listener right now who is in the throes of it and feeling isolated, lonely, embarrassed, ashamed, afraid. Maybe a word of hope for her, and what you see as a possibility for us, that this doesn't have to be something of an isolated life sentence.
You put that so well. Yes, the maternal mental health crisis, the maternal health crisis is gruesome, and it's a political decision. So if we look at matrescence and how our societies treat women, pregnant women as they're giving birth and afterwards, it's a real avenue with which it illuminates our political structures and our ideas of value. So in the UK, Black women and women of ethnic minorities are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. We know that women who are from socioeconomic disadvantage, poverty, refugees, again, Black or Asian women, are much more likely to suffer from postnatal depression. So, yeah, it's a place where the inequalities, the structural racism in our society is laid bare, and that it's not a national emergency is beyond me, and it must be. So your first question, how has learning all about this changed my rhythms? it has taken me a while to loosen myself from some of the ideas of the maternal ideal. I don't beat myself up as much as I once did. Um, I try and challenge the idea in my head, which is still there, which is that can't I can't have time to look after myself. I kind of feel naturally like I should spend all my time with my children or being productive and working. And in motherhood, taking any time for me has been really challenging. I'm trying to learn how to accept help and to ask for help a bit more. Um, but for the listener who is in the thick of it, and I feel so strongly for you and those people out there. I've done a lot of events in the last year where in a literary event you talk for 45 minutes and there's a kind of 10-15 minute Q&A, and often there's a signing afterwards. And what really stays with me are those women. Sometimes they come with their babies and they're crying and they're traumatized and they feel abandoned by society. And if you zoom out on that, what could be more cruel for a woman to give birth, go through something so difficult, and of course there was a wonderful baby, but then she's left. And I mean, it makes me so angry, and that's what fuels my writing. But to that woman, I would say, reach out, find your people, listen to podcasts. Like I found my village very much often online, like podcasts like this, listening to voices of women who were lifting up other women, saying it as it is, you know, audiobooks, because sometimes it's really hard to get out. You must try and get out of a baby, but sometimes it's tricky. So, there's a lot of good stuff online, I think, challenging the idea. And also just know that there's nothing wrong with you. It's not you, it's the system. And it's the isolated institution of intensive mothering, which is failing us and which is changing. Like I feel really confident that there's so many people pushing back on this and that there's like a reservoir of anger and power which is being released. And we're making it different.
I agree. I have the advantage of hosting a space where I am having a lot of important and leading conversations. And so I have so many interesting thinkers and researchers and scientists and doctors and activists on this show. And so to your point, this idea is elevated and amplified right now. And I am hopeful. I'm hopeful for what this will ultimately mean for the next generation. I mean, I can tell you, I've got a daughter who's about to turn 24, and this has trickled down. That they do not have some of these antiquated ideas about what will be required of them and what motherhood should look like, and even if they want to be a mom at all. But if it's working, is my point. I think new instruction, new science, louder conversations, more writers like you. Like I said earlier, words matter, and they change people's minds and they deliver hope. And I hope that we are among the last generations of mothers who felt so alone during this phase of life, that the rhythms do indeed shift. I'm so glad that your book is making its way over here to the States. It's a mess over here, as you might be knowing. It is a mess for mothers right now. Our bodies are in danger. Our motherhood story is in danger. And so we need the good voices more than ever. And so your book is out. Can you tell my listeners, this is where they can find you. This is where they can follow you. This is where they can find your book, all the things.
Yeah, sure. And I just loved what you just said. And I think, if we could just say to people, how's your matrescence? Or like, how was your matrescence? Just that, it brings out a space for people to think about how they're doing. So you can find me. I am on Instagram, Lucy F. Jones. I have a website. I'm on Twitter, or X, whatever it is, but not very much. I'm mostly on Instagram. And Matrescence is out in the States May 7th or 9th, I think.
Yes. Marvelous. Fantastic. Thanks for being on today. I feel hopeful having listened to you, and a touch less lonely. I think that, to your point, connection it's powerful. This thing where we get to say to one another, oh yeah, me too. That's normal. That's normal. Like, we're here with you in it. Is hell, it feels like 80% of it.
It really does. Yeah. Being able, and, to say kind of like, of course you feel that, this is hard, and that's okay. You're going to get through it. And yeah, I think I really agree that 80%, I think there's so much in that which can then lead to social change.
That's right. Okay, Lucy, great to meet you. I'm so glad that you were here, and thank you for giving us a whole hour of your time. I'm just telling you that I know that this episode is going to mean a lot to a lot of people. So appreciate you.
I am so grateful, and thank you so much. And I also really want to read your books. I really want to. Where shall I start?
I'll send them to you.
Oh,
I will send them to you.
I will buy them.
You will not.
Support you as an author.
You will not.
But, I particularly want to read the one which is about excess or moderation, or what's it called?
Oh, 7. Oh, that was a huge season of life. Yeah, okay. It was a kind of an experiment against like our excessive culture. It was life-changing, to be honest.
I really want to read that. I'm very interested, and I'm going to let you go, but I'm just dying to read your words, and thank you very much.
I so love the matriarchy of scientists who are bringing us new data, new revelations, new learnings. And I mean, if it isn't clear, there's no incentive for a patriarchal culture to spend a lot of time, money, and energy on researching some of this stuff, because it's girl stuff. So of course, it's the women coming in saying, this is a worthy subject and we are worthy of the investment. And the story that we've been handed can be so harmful and isolating. I'm just telling you, women should be in charge of everything. I loved Lucy. She was just the exact sort of presence I thought she was going to be, which was nurturing and gentle and generous and kind. And so over at jenhatmaker.com under the podcast tab, I will have it all rounded up for you. This episode, the show notes, handles for Lucy's socials, obviously links to her book. This might be the exact book to put into the hands of our favorite young, fresh, new pregnant moms. Right? This is the story we want them to know, so that from the jump, they never feel lonely, not for a day. More to come in this amazing series on the matriarchy, which we love here at the show. It's our favorite drum to beat. Believe in women so much. So thanks for being here, guys. We sure love you, and we'll see you next week.